When the Confederate Army found itself short-staffed and losing the Civil War, out of desperation, they considered the possibility of arming their slaves in the good fight to protect their God-given right to own those they called black people. But this recruitment process was not as easy as it first appeared. There were some walls that were in the way that made it difficult to climb over. Studying from Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, we'll take a closer peek into this dilemma. Even as the white South persisted in touting the fidelity, contentment, and docility of its black population, there were limits to how much trust could be reposed in them and to what kinds of services they would be permitted to render. The employment of blacks as military laborers and body servants occasioned no particular alarm, as their duties were consistent with the servile position they occupied in Southern society. Their position in the war could be that of a personal attendant. They could iron clothes, cook meals, dig trenches, tend to the horses, and other related tasks without a problem. They were used to being in such servile positions on the plantation. This was their normal position in Southern society. But the proposal to enlist blacks as regular soldiers proved to be a different matter altogether. That was something totally different. Why? Because it removed them from the waterboy position and it placed them in the game, which means that they would have been on equal terms with other Southern whites, which was out of code for that institution and society. Negroes serving in that capacity would have created a symbol for Southern white society, transmitting a message that they were unprepared and unwilling to accept. And this was one wall that was in the way of enlisting blacks as Confederate soldiers. But there were others. In opposing any such move, an Alabama legislator could think of no more effective argument than the example of his own body servant,
who had grown up with him from boyhood, who had gone with him to the army and had shared with him, share and share alike, every article of food and clothing,
and yet, inexplicably,
had seized the first opportunity which presented of deserting him and joining the Yankees.
Negroes taken off was of concern to this legislator. Who could explain how being raised with this Negro since childhood resulted in him taking flight as soon as he got a chance? If he wouldn't stay, then who would? Nevertheless, the Confederacy would have to confront the issue of slaves as soldiers, particularly after the Yankees began to reap such successes from the experiment. And the Negroes on the Yankee side got busy, right? We're going to hear about them in later commentaries. After the bombardment of Fort Sumter, free blacks in several towns organized themselves into military companies and offered their services to their respective states. Here we go again with some of the free blacks just dying to show their commitment to the whites and doing all sorts of activities to keep down the blacks. And I want you to keep this in mind because this mentality is going to keep popping up all throughout history, all the way up until today. And that's why it's a crazy thing to trust anyone just because they share a similar skin complexion. The most notable example proved to be the free-colored community of New Orleans, with its strong Creole element and the tradition of having fought under Andrew Jackson in 1815, after announcing early in the war their determination to
take arms at a moment's notice and fight shoulder to shoulder with other citizens
in defense of the city. 2 regiments of free-colored men, known as the Native Guards, were soon parading the streets with white soldiers. There they go. Their dream had come true. Although formally incorporated into the Louisiana militia, the Native Guards were never called upon for combat duty. The larger society wasn't going for it. Like we talked about, letting Negroes fight on equal footings means chipping away at the institution of slavery and white supremacy. In that worldview, when ideally functioning, those labeled as blacks are only at the bottom positions, no exceptions, not even in the military, which is why the free Negroes parading in the streets with the whites did not get called for combat. The same disinclination to employ black troops appeared elsewhere in the Confederacy. When 60 Richmond free blacks, bearing a Confederate flag, proffered their services as soldiers, the local authorities praised their loyalty and sent them home. They thought they were doing something by bringing the Confederate flags out. The whites looked at it and said, "Good job. We see your support. Now go back home and take a seat." Whether such volunteers were motivated by opportunism, a genuine patriotism, community coercion, or the prospect of better treatment is difficult to determine. It could have been a mixture of all. but I'm willing to bet that genuine patriotism was one for sure.
By serving the Confederates, a New Orleans black leader later explained, they had hoped to improve their legal and social position.
Legal status, yes, but impossible for social position. No person checking any racial status other than white is equal in the eyes of society, nor can they ever be in the white invented racial categories. You have to move completely away from seeing the world through the lens of race, right, to get any sense of social equality, especially if you're someone who thinks of themselves as blacks. You have every incentive to support a change in worldview, being that the racial worldview has you as black and at the very bottom, where it's dark and has no light, right? So again, a New Orleans leader said he hoped to improve his legal and social position.
At the same time, almost in self-defense, they had felt the need to prove their fighting abilities and to learn the use of firearms, thereby raising their esteem among both the whites and their own people.
Here's what he said.
No matter where I fight,
A New Orleans black later told the Yankees,
I only wish to spend what I have and fight as long as I can, if only my boy may stand in the street equal to a white boy when the war is over.
Striving for a concept of equality created by whites that can only be attained by people who qualify to be white. It's a losing game for everyone else, because you literally have to be reborn as someone of mostly stereotypical European ancestry to make this become true. And that's not happening, right? Now, if he's referring to equality under the law or changing the entire social value system, then those were real possibilities worth fighting for. Let's continue.
When Colonel James Chestnut slaves volunteered in March 1862
to fight for him if he would arm them,
he professed to believe them, but one person could not make that decision, he told them.
The whole country must agree to it.
And did the whole country agree on it? We're going to find out.
Although there had been some proposals early in the war to enlist slaves, usually in the form of appeals from planters in threatened areas for permission to arm their slaves, the wisdom of such a drastic move was never seriously debated by the Confederacy until late in 1863,
when they began to realize that this war wasn't some walk in the park like some of them thought it would be.
With the steady deterioration of the military effort, the question suddenly took on a new importance. In the ensuing and often far-reaching debate, the reasons advanced for slave enlistments ranged from the improved moral position of the South in the world community to how it might demoralize the black Yankees. But the most compelling argument, as it had been in the North, was that of military necessity. For some whites at least, the urgent need to preserve the independence of the South took precedence over the institution upon which it was based,
which was slavery. Points in the war had some whites considering arming their Negroes to help them win, because the loss of the war goes their institution, upon which their society was based upon.
And the system they had initially viewed as the economic strength of the South now loomed as a critical source of military manpower as well.
The element which has been the foundation of wealth should now be made the instrument of our salvation.
A Mississippi slaveholder told his fellow planters,
Arm our slaves.
Here we go. Give weapons to the human tools that have made us wealthy, and let these tools be used for the purpose of helping us win the war.
If the Confederacy failed to utilize this manpower, he warned,
the Yankees will, and the terminal scenes of this struggle will be the subjugation of the Southern gentleman by his own slaves.
Uh-oh.
It behooved every patriotic slaveholder then to
prepare the Negro's mind for the position he is about to assume.
What does he mean to prepare the Negro's mind? That means to introduce ideas in him to reconfigure his way of thinking. In this context, it means to suppress thoughts of submissiveness, servitude, and being a slave, and instill thoughts of dominance, discipline, and destruction for war, right? That's how they could prepare his mind for the position he was about to assume.
And excite in him that love of country and of home, which I believe exists strongly in the Negro's breast.
Having reprinted this slaveholder's appeal, the New Orleans Tribune, a black newspaper established in 1864, could not help but comment on its tragic irony.
The chivalrous Southerners, after bragging so long of their superiority above all other people, are now, in the pangs of agony, stretching their hands for help to those for whose enslavement they are trying to destroy their country. They have, with their own lips and by their own acts, given the lie to their diabolical purpose.
Meaning they have contradicted their notion of blacks being only fit for slavery, because it appears that they see them fit for other things when we have people saying, arm the slaves and prepare the Negro's mind for the position he will assume.
After the military reverses of late 1864, the Confederacy edged still closer to raising a black army. If nothing else, the heavy casualties they were sustaining impressed whites with the need to draw upon their immense reservoir of black manpower. Why condemn to destruction?
The flower of our population, the hope of the country,
A Virginia newspaper asked,
rather than mold to our use and make subsidiary to the great ends of independence, the inferior race that has so long acknowledged our guidance and control. Surely they are good enough for Yankee bullets.
What little was left of slavery, Mary F. Aiken wrote her husband in the Confederate Congress,
should be rendered as serviceable as possible, and for that reason the Negro men ought to be put to fighting, and where some of them will be killed.
Now look at her.
If it is not done, there will soon be more Negroes than whites in the country, and they will be the free race. I want to see them got rid of soon.
Look at these ideas that occupied these people's minds. It was this type of thinking that made them fall into their own pit, right? They cast themselves far away from the rest of the human family thinking like this. And a lot of them just don't know how much white supremacy disconnects them from the rest of humanity, right? That's why people like Mr. Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington refer to them as victims of slavery as well. But let's continue.
Walter Clark, a young Confederate officer, had initially opposed the enlistment of blacks, but he now thought the policy deserved full support.
Let Negro fight Negro,
he advised.
This is an age of progressive ideas and mighty changes.
You can just tell they were desperate at this point.
The arguments grew increasingly bitter and vindictive as the war reached a desperate point. On March 13, 1865, the Confederate Congress, with the strong backing of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, finally authorized the enlistment of 300,000 additional troops, irrespective of color.
Irrespective of color. The person with the rich brown skin could finally fight. Will they do so? And how many? Let's see.
To allay the fears of many whites, the act stipulated that no state was to enlist more than 25% of her able-bodied slave population between the ages of 18 and 45. Within a few days, advertisements appeared in newspapers to urge the recruitment of blacks. In Richmond, a company of blacks in Confederate uniforms paraded in the streets to attract additional volunteers.
Here goes the Richmond Free Blacks again, babooning on the streets and trying to attract people to keep slavery alive.
Among those witnessing the spectacle was John S. Wise, a Confederate officer and the son of a former governor of Virginia. He thought, as he watched the
Confederate darkies
drill in Capitol Square.
This is but the beginning of the end.
They must have looked pretty bad, but they still tried.
Although the law authorizing black recruits avoided the question of emancipation, leaving that decision to the slave owners and the states, the clear implication was that slaves who served in the Confederate Army would be freed at the end of the war. But the promise of freedom as a reward for military service, whether by law or by implication, came too late to impress or deceive most slaves.
"I'll work for Massa Randolph good enough,"
said a slave belonging to the former Confederate Secretary of War.
"but no one to fight for Massa Davis."
That's Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. They already had this man working for Massa Randolph, but fighting in the war for Massa Davis, that was taking it way too far for him, right? Here we go.
Bewildered by the remark, someone asked him how he could stand by idly while the Yankees robbed his master.
"I knows nothing about politics,"
the slave replied. But when told that he might win his freedom by enlisting, this same slave suddenly revealed a sound grasp of politics.
"We niggas that fight will be free, course. But you see, Massa, if some of us don't fight, we all be free. Massa Linium says."
That's Abraham Lincoln he's talking about. And this is the hot slave wisdom. The ones who fight, yeah, for sure, they'll get set free. But if we don't fight, we'll all get free. That's letting the person know that he understood the Confederacy was losing to the Union. And it was only a matter of time before all the slaves went free. So why fight, right? This is hot stuff right here. It's hot because it's simple and it just makes sense.
When slaves were later questioned by Union soldiers about their willingness to bear arms for the Confederacy, they no doubt told them what they wanted to hear, but there is little reason in this instance to suspect the blacks of duplicity.
My master offers me my freedom if I will take up arms.
One slave told an escaped Union prisoner,
But I have a wife and 5 children, and he does not offer them their freedom. And we have come to the conclusion that there is no use fighting for our masters and our freedom, when any children we may have are to be made slaves. And we have thought when we get arms and are allowed to be together in regiments, we can demand freedom for our wives and children and take it.
I don't blame him at all. That seemed about one of the only effective ways to get white Southerners to listen at that time, because they could not be reasoned with on this subject of slavery. They just could not comprehend anything that went against what they wanted to be true on this topic, which is one of the reasons why the bloody Civil War had to be fought in the first place, right? So this man knew that he had to get his weapons and demand freedom.
the day the Confederacy arms its slaves, a Georgia black assured General Sherman,
That day, the war ends.
equally explicit, another slave vowed that his people would never have fought the Yankees.
I have heard the colored folks talk of it. They knowed all about it. They'll turn the guns on the Rebs.
Many of them maybe, but certainly there would have been some right there next to the white rebels shooting all types of Yankees. Just like the slave said he would do when they shot his master in the face and cracked Billy's jaw open. He was ready to kill all the Yankees. But it is possible that many would have turned the guns on the rebels, right? We'll never know.
The Confederacy had anticipated little difficulty in mobilizing slaves for military duty, nor did the proponents of black enlistments doubt the efficiency with which such soldiers would serve. After all, an Alabama newspaper suggested,
Masters and overseers can marshal them for battle by the same authority and habit of obedience with which they are marshaled to labor.
The end of the war, however, rendered such questions academic. Few slaves were ever enlisted, and none of them apparently had the opportunity to fight.
So they didn't fight. The white Southern pride was just way too much in the way, and it contributed to their demise.
Had the Confederacy managed to raise a black army, it would seem unlikely, particularly after 1863, that it could have fought with the same sense of commitment and self-pride that propelled the black troops in the Union Army. When he first heard of the act to recruit blacks for the Confederate Army, a Virginia freedman recalled, he had suddenly found himself unable to restrain his emotions.
They asked me if I would fight for my country. I said, I have no country.
And that's how it went. Many blacks supported the Confederacy, but in non-military roles. Some of them would have gladly joined the military, but others were wise enough not to. And with that, we continueth to the next. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.